Welcome, everybody, to our podcast episode. Our topic today is what vets are not taught about raw feeding in school. So we have the lovely Dr. Katy Miller with us. Thank you so much for joining us today. Why don't you give our listeners just a little bit of a background of who you are and what you're currently working on?
Sounds great. I am Dr. Katy Miller, and I am trained as a veterinarian. And then after I got out of school, I've specialized in small animal nutrition. So I started off as a veterinarian. I was in general practice for 3 years. I was a emergency vet for 5 years. And then I had a midlife crisis and decided that I was going to focus on small animal nutrition, and started with a retail company and worked with a retail company for 12 years in charge of their education, research, and anything consumable. And then I have now started 2 years ago a position with BSM Partners, which we do a lot of research, formulation, and kind of being able to help the industry as a whole instead of just one, being able to focus on one retailer. Now I can educate the industry as a whole with the position that I have now.
Oh, I love to hear that.
Yes, please help once.
Yeah, we love that kind of midlife crisis. So Dr. Katy, if you don't mind, kind of walk us through a little bit of what the nutrition side of your education in vet school, what did that look like? And what did you gain or maybe not gain from that experience?
Well, my nutrition education was pretty limited. It was taught in vet school as kind of part of internal medicine. So we would be reviewing internal medicine and in reviewing a disease. And then we would learn about the nutritional aspects of that disease, and then told the ABC diet, as I call it, that would be appropriate to feed said pet. So a lot of those are your prescription products. And we were told that, okay, if your pet has X, then this is what you feed as Y, and that's it. And then not really told much. And we were kind of told what nutrients you're going to be controlling for, but the only idea that you were given was one diet, or one or two diets, which are made by the big prescription companies. And then my general nutrition was, I walked in at lunch or after lunch, and after lunch I had the clinical nutrition book put on my desk that was written by Hills. That we all have. It's a really famous book that we all have, and that's where our nutrition education came from. But it was just given to us as, here, this is free for you to read, and not much actually learning about what was in that book or what it had anything to do with. And I probably didn't pick it up until I became interested in nutrition and decided I wanted to know a little bit more about nutrition. Then I dove in on my own.
Interesting. So they just handed you a big fat book and said, if you feel inclined, go ahead, look into it. But there was no actual course or lecture on nutrition. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, our nutrition was learned basically in side by side with your internal medicine. And it wasn't really about nutrition itself. It was about how do you nutritionally handle diseases that you see in a veterinary hospital. And so even very basic conversations about nutrition, I didn't learn how to have those until I was in practice.
Wow.
Wow. Okay. So it sounds like retroactive, like we're not being proactive about nutrition or the needs of the pet. We're looking at a disease state and saying, now how do we incorporate nutrition differently?
Correct. So it was kind of, if your pet is on a dog food, which was typically kibble, then you stay on that diet unless they have a disease or a problem with that diet. That's what they live on, is the recipe that they were put on as a puppy, or, just maybe a new adult, and that's it. And then that's what they continued on for the rest of their life, unless there was a problem. And then we have to look at the nutrition, but only if there was a problem, like a health problem that we needed to consider.
Wow, that is
Interesting. Alarming, but also very interesting that it's like an afterthought, not first and foremost a go-to. So basically they're saying if there's this illness, this is the food that has been designed to treat this illness based on its nutritional needs at the state that it's in. But they could be on it forever. I've had that happen with customers that came in and their dog had a sensitive stomach for a moment, but they're still on a prescription sensitive stomach formula, which is always surprising to me because, things happen. Sometimes there's upset stomachs, but I don't ever see, a dog being deemed forever sensitive stomach. So that's fascinating.
Yeah, I think it's really more like a way of looking at it and being reactionary to whatever the pet is presenting with instead of being proactive about the diet.
absolutely.
So when I had a technician come to me and say in the middle of the night, I was working in the emergency room, and she was like, "Hey, are you still looking for a different job?" And I was like, "Yeah, it'd be really nice to treat these animals before they were sick or unhappy and in my clinic." And she said, "Well, I know of this, she went to work for this retail company. She's like, I know that they're looking for a vet." And I said, "Well, what would a vet do at a pet retail company? Like, I don't understand why you would need one, but they're advertising for a vet. So why don't I apply?" So I did, and I got the job. And then it was learning on the ground from there, figuring out this nutrition, figuring out that book that was left on my desk, why it was left on my desk and what information it contained, and then getting further certifications after that. Just anything I could do to learn more about nutrition.
So I'm assuming that book that was left on your desk when you were in vet school, those diets in there, I'm assuming they were not raw diets. They had nothing about raw feeding involved.
No, the only thing about raw feeding is, well, so I'm going to date myself. So this was like 2005. So this was a while before raw nutrition became mainstream and that people were doing it. Like not a lot of people in 2005 were feeding raw diets. So it wasn't much of even a topic, except to maybe if you heard about it, don't do it because it's going to be contaminated with all this scary bacteria. And so just don't do it. That's all you had to know about it. And actually, that's how I became interested in the retail company that I went to work for, was that my technician was going to pick up raw food for her cat. And I was like, I know nothing about raw food. Can you tell me more about it? And she said, well, hold on, I'll go there and they have information. And so she went and got written information and brought it back to me. And I was like, wow, this is really cool. And it became like the new place that I would send people to, because they actually had information on nutrition and information, like tons, all these handouts and written information that could go home with you, where you could educate yourself on the raw feeding. And I thought that was just amazing. And that would be a great company to work for, one where education was at the center of what they do.
That's amazing, because that's obviously proactive measures that you're taking when you're educating consumers to make the most informed decision on nutrition, what to feed their pet, what helps them thrive, rather than just getting by. And if it's broke, don't fix it mentality that I think a lot of people have been, sort of, I use the term brainwashed a lot, but it is sort of brainwashing in a sense where if it's working and they've been on it their whole life, why would you change the food? That's such a backwards way of thinking when it comes to a food or a diet that you eat every single day. It's never normal to feed the same thing every single day for the entirety of a pet's life. That's just not, that's not right. So question popped up when you were talking about your shift from the emergency clinic that you were working in, and you had a conversation where you were saying, I would really like to see these pets before they have to see an emergency vet, right? So kind of walk us through that, I guess, realization or, mind frame change that happened with you. Were you seeing that these diets were causing problems? Were they effective once you implemented them with the sick pets?
Well, I think it's hard to look at it and say I saw problems caused by diet, which I know now with the education that I have that a lot of these problems can be caused by diet. But at the time I was still in that school of thought of, you put them on this diet, they stay on it their whole life, and why would you change it? And if you change it, you're going to get gastric upset. So God forbid you do that. Don't do that unless there's a problem.
Right.
And then you get a problem and it's like, all of a sudden now I need to switch the food. Well, now I have these pets that are being switched to these foods that they won't eat. And so it can provide the best nutrition possible, but they're not eating it. I actually had a technician who would taste all of them. And so he had tasted all the diets and could tell you what they tasted like. I thought that was ultimate commitment to the job there.
Yeah, we need to see that and have a conversation with them. That's so interesting.
So I could tell you that the diet tasted really bad, and that's probably why the pet wouldn't eat it. But it wasn't about palatability or making sure that we got that effective diet in the pet. It was just, these are your options, and that's all there is. And I think that my eyes were really opened in coming into the industry and being able to see that, ask some of those common sense questions, like, does it make sense to be on the same food for your entire life? And basically realizing that kibble is like cereal. It's fortified with vitamins and minerals. It's made out of the same machinery that a cereal's made on. And it makes these puffy little kibbles that you eat for your whole life. And I couldn't imagine eating the same cereal. My little, Honey Nut Cheerios is pretty healthy. It's got a little honey in it, a little sugar, but not bad. But to realize that I wouldn't want to eat that or feed that to my child every day for their entire life and feel like they were healthy.
Yes.
We use that same analogy all the time. We are always talking about how to humanize it so that, our customers can think about the same connection that they make with their food. But it's no different than, I was talking about protein bars, right? They're complete and balanced. You could eat 4 or 5 a day and probably be fine. But again, would you want to eat the same thing all the time? And it's a dry bar. You're not getting your variety of nutrients that you would when you eat a variety of proteins, fruits, and veggies. Same thing for the dogs and cats. So we're constantly making that analogy too. So I'm glad you say the same thing, because it just, when you say it out loud too, it makes more sense, right? Like, it just for people to think about it in the human world and then for their pet. And I know some people will they'll even say my dog eats better than me, when they're doing raw food or, doing any kind of fresher food options. So it's great to hear.
So, quick question about kind of the raw feeding introduction that you got in vet school. You mentioned that it basically wasn't brought up, but if it was a don't do it, end of story conversation. What, after you got into kind of the pet food industry on the retail side of things, what did you learn about raw feeding? Did you have your reservations at that time? Do you still have reservations? Where are you at now with raw feeding?
Well, I'm a proponent of raw feeding. I don't think it's right for everybody or every dog, but I think that there are a lot of dogs out there and cats that thrive on that feeding style. And I did have to do a lot of research and education on my own. So I became certified in Chinese medicine and Chinese food therapy for pets. And that got me into a whole food feeding philosophy and why that was important and how that can affect your health, and just feeding whole foods, even if they're cooked. And then you just kind of take that a step farther and say, okay, well, now what if we fed them raw, like a pet would, naturally eat them in the wild? And I was I think that a lot of naysayers to it say, well, it's all anecdotal evidence that you have that they're doing better. But I can tell you that I do see an improvement. I do see that pets thriving and feeling better when they're on a less processed food. And I try to kind of liken it to myself. If I go on a real strict diet and I don't eat, say I'm going to go on like a keto diet. So a lot of like really high protein, high fat, and I'm not eating as many vegetables as I should because I'm trying to keep my carb load down. You kind of get to feeling a certain way. And then when you introduce you go back and you start to introduce salads and fruits and vegetables back into your diet, it really does make you feel better to have more variety in that diet and have more whole foods, and really embracing that concept that whole foods or raw foods, when it comes to our pets, does make you feel better. You're getting the moisture that you need, you're getting the nutrients that you need, but you're also getting all those other things that we don't think about when we formulate food, like phytonutrients and, all those these chemical compounds and peptides and things that are in the food that we strip away when we make a really sterile, kibble. We kind of strip away all those things that are actually really good for us and have a purpose. And God put them here for a reason. Like there's a reason that our plants contain all the things that you need. And I look at it like plants, you see certain plants that like they will have a toxic substance in them, but a lot of times they'll also have the antitoxin along with it. Like it's in the same plant because it's there on purpose. Like it's there to balance, and everything in it is as an importance of balance. And so I think that we strip away a lot of the important nutrients when we look, if we just say that a nutrient is a nutrient, which is what a lot of veterinary nutritionists and nutritionists in general will tell you, is that a nutrient is a nutrient. It doesn't matter where it came from. And what I like to say is I don't know everything about nature or God or how he made this, but I know that everything I need is in that plant, the whole plant, not just one piece of that plant or animal.
I love that, because that's it falls in the philosophy of traditional Chinese medicine, right? Where it is about balance. It's about yin and yang. And you're right about obviously the plants having balance within them, foods having balance within them, animals having balance within them. Everything in nature, everything that exists naturally has that balance. And I always touch on that same point, Dr. Katy, that there are so many things outside of just that nutrient or the nutrient profile that we're looking at, that AAFCO is concerned about being complete and balanced. There are so many more things that help animals and humans alike thrive, or their organ systems work more efficiently even, you know what I mean? And part of it are the things that you mentioned, and most all of those nutrients that you just mentioned, you're right, they're getting stripped away in the cooking process. So that is in my opinion, one of the big reasons why raw does what it does when we feed it to a pet that's been fed primarily a processed diet. That's why we see that kind of rebound effect, is because those things cannot exist in a kibble. They can't exist in highly processed food at all. And even when they're added back in synthetically, they don't work the same as they do in that whole food form. And I think that's really important for, vets that are being the ones that have, a lot of the time conversations about, hey, what are you feeding your pet? And then letting that patient know either that's approved by them or not. I think it's important for them to see the bigger picture of nutrition that way, and have a bit of a deeper understanding about the raw food side of things, where it's clear to me, at least in the last 20 or so years, right, that this hasn't been any bit of a focus, right? Raw feeding is not a focus in vet school. And it seems like nutrition is maybe coming along a little bit more these days, but it's still not where it needs to be to gain the expertise required to talk on both sides of that subject. So what do you propose, customers like ours or stores like ours that are trying to get factual, evidence-based information out there about other ways to feed other than the big conglomerate kibble companies, right? There are so many options out there right now. What do you think that we can do to kind of spread this message in a way that's helpful for everyone?
I personally like a lot of written information. So having something written down that you can take to your vet and be able to review it with them and say, hey, these are the things that I found. And so sometimes it's really hard to have that conversation with your vet. Like your vet is busy and they may not be at the same place that you are in how you feed. But if you go in and you kind of have your list and if you have some stuff to back it up, even bring that in and say, look, this is what I found. What do you think of it? And they can kind of help evaluate it from the side of science. Well, this is an opinion article, or, this doesn't have the science behind it. So that's why I feel the way that I do. Or you're right, this is a really good paper written about this, and that this is a really good idea that's happening. But I think if you have it written down so that you can kind of go over it and you don't forget things, or like, well, I was reading this one thing on the internet, they're gonna automatically think that you went to Dr. Google, and let's not do that anymore. Yes. But maybe you went to Google Scholar and you got a paper on it, and that's something different. We can talk about that, and I can understand that and where the science comes from that. So I think that really being armed with information that you can share is helpful. And I think that being able to show that you're passionate and that you care about it, I think it helps make that conversation easier for the vet and not make it confrontational. Not like, I'm here to change your mind about raw feeding. But hey, this is what I've decided to do with my dog, and this is the reasons why I do it with my dog. And could you help me evaluate this? Or, what is your opinion on this? And, some of them may get you the canned answer of, well, AHA and AVMA say no to raw feeding, so I say no to raw feeding. But what if you went in there and you said, okay, well, I am feeding my dog this raw dog food, but I know, I called the company and I found out that they do high pressure pasteurization, which is a technique to help reduce bacteria. And so, here's what I have here. I know your concern is going to be bacterial contamination. So here I have this factual, scientifically based protocol that the company that I'm feeding uses. So would you be okay with that? Or have you ever heard of that? I'm sure I mean, there's even people in the food industry that I say HPP to, and they're like, what? It's like, oh, it's a high pressure pasteurization. It's a kill step. And so, but not everybody is that familiar with it. And so being able to be armed with things, to be able to come to them and say, well, this is why I'm doing this. And here's what I feel is the evidence of why I'm doing it, can help.
I love that. So the message is don't necessarily be afraid to let your vet know, even if they have voiced maybe concerns or that they don't approve of raw feeding in the past. Don't be afraid to let them know, hey, this is a decision I've made for my pet. And yeah, here's some, safety measures that this particular brand that I feed takes in order to, reduce the risk, just like any other food too, mind you guys, for all of our listeners here, just as a side note, the raw food companies are, at least the reputable ones, right? Which I'm not going to go into that list obviously right now, but there are reputable raw food companies that go through so many measures to make sure that their food is safe. And they do
transparent about it too. It's, the testing is right there. You can go to their website. It's a great resource.
Absolutely. And they're doing that because that is their company. That is literally the basis of their company, is to make raw food. So Of course, they're going to go through every measure that they can in order to ensure safety and efficacy of their food and their products. But that's science that we actually can provide to vets. And to speak to Dr. Katy's point about vets needing that hard science, the facts, and not opinions, not anecdotal evidence, that's not going to really work in a lot of the vets' minds. And if we can provide them some of the more factual things like, hey, this is these safety measures, and these are FDA approved safety measures, whatever, however far we can get into that side of things, the better. And just not being afraid to open that conversation in the first place, because I know from my own personal experience, I have avoided that conversation for the most part. I haven't even told, a new vet that I've been seeing that we feed raw. I just don't even have the conversation. And as soon as they recommend a food for whatever reason, I just say, okay, thanks, never mind. I don't even, offer. That would be anecdotal evidence for them at some point if they get enough clinical experience with their patients being fed raw diets. At some point, their lights are going to turn on and say, okay, I might want to look into this at this point, right? So that's another kind of way that we can, I guess, spread that information or awareness, and then let them on their own accord look into it. And like Dr. Katy said, we're not trying to change minds. We're not being confrontational. We're just supplying them with information.
Yeah, I think the really important thing is to not be confrontational about it, even if they're confrontational back. It's trying to keep that dialogue open. I would much rather someone come into my clinic and say, this is the way that I feed their pet, and be honest about it so that we can have that conversation. And maybe I don't approve of the way that you feed, but that's okay. Like we can have differing opinions. Mm-hmm. But it's, you're the advocate as an owner for your pet, and what they do best on. And so that's, but being honest about it, I think, is really important. And it allows them to, if they feel the need to be cautious about having that pet in the hospital, and they're worried about bacteria that goes through the dog and can come out the other end. So, there's some cleaning practices that they might take that are a little bit different. And so being honest about that is important up front, so that they know to do that, because they may have immunocompromised animals in the back. You don't know, who they're treating that's back in their hospital or something like that. And there is some risk that could be there if a pet's not healthy. So letting them know ahead of time, I think having that conversation, I think, is important.
Yeah, I think there's something to be said, like Erika said too. The more that it's voiced, the more curious it might bring light to some of the vets out there, where they're like, this is the 10th person this week that has mentioned a raw diet, and I didn't used to get that many people saying it, and I'm getting more and more, and they start seeing that uptick, and maybe then they might be a little more open-minded to some of the research and some of the information out there. So I love that approach, definitely.
Yeah, and they might even say, like, look, it's curious that I've seen, 3 dogs this week. All of them have great skin and coat, and they're on, they are feeding raw diets. Or, I did have I had a patient that was having intestinal distress, it had chronic diarrhea or something like that. And this owner switched to a raw diet, and it really worked for them. Well, that starts to build that that confidence in you that maybe it isn't as scary as some of the veterinary industry can make it sound. They make it sound like it's anybody that eats raw food or touches raw food is going to come down with a pathogenic bacteria and die from it. Kind of the feeling that you get. And we need to break that feeling, and that just realize that, like, I've seen this many patients this week that have all been on raw feeding, and none of them have been here because of bacterial contamination from their food.
Yeah. And I have a spin-off. I keep thinking when we're talking about vets needing the hard science of why to feed raw, I always kind of go back to it. Why wouldn't you feed raw? And this is, again, this is leaning on, we're just observing what a dog and cat would naturally consume in the wild if we were just totally not involved in that process, which we weren't for the overwhelming majority of the time they've been on Earth, right? Like, it's insane how long they've been doing it on their own and how little time that we have been intervening in creating pet foods. Is that not enough for the veterinary community to kind of just, if we observe basic anatomy and physiology of a dog and cat, right, in the wild, we're not a part of this, what would they be eating? What and this is funny because this is a podcast topic we've had. What would they eat if we weren't involved? And that would be raw food, because they do not have the ability to cook their food. And so they have, multiple different safety mechanisms literally built into their anatomy, their physiology, that helps them consume, digest, and utilize raw foods. So where is that logic? Where does that fall kind of in your mind currently with what you've learned outside of vet school? And where do you think that logic falls within a more conventional vet that maybe hasn't dived into pet nutrition specifically after vet school?
Well, I think veterinarians are going to have a problem wrapping their mind around anything that doesn't have a scientific test to it. Like it's just the way that they're built, the way that they're taught, the way that their brains work, is that you have to have this really clean, you want this really clean scientific study to be able to say that this is what I fed, this is what happened, and there were no other variables that could happen with this pet. Like, you control every variable. And we just aren't gonna get that much of it. Like, you kind of have to say, well, I'm not going to be able to, somebody's got to fund this research that's, $1 million, $500,000 or more for a research paper on the benefits of raw feeding. Well, somebody has to fund that. And the funding isn't there to support what so many people anecdotally find on their own. We don't get the same support for the scientific part of it. And so vets are going to struggle with it, and they're going to have a hard time with it. But I try to have them think of it as they do with themselves. If you eat McDonald's every day for a week, how do you feel? If you eat a salad every day for a week, how do you feel? And trying to kind of get them to see, like, to relate to it, to be able to bond with that and go with that feeling and say, yeah, I do know that I feel a lot better when I'm eating a whole food diet. And then when I eat a highly processed diet, I feel a lot better. Gosh, maybe my pet would feel better too. Like, do I die if I'm going to eat McDonald's every day for a week? No. Am I going to feel like crud and not want to get up and not want to play ball, not want to go for walks? I'm going to gain weight and not be kind of grumpy. That's what I want to know. This is my question to everybody: are cats grumpy because they're chronically dehydrated?
Love that. Love that.
My question. Yeah. Let's get answers. Anyone that has a grumpy cat, check it,
because they have a headache.
Might have excuse. Might have zero excuse. They're raw fed and they're still grumpy.
Oh no!
Oh, darn.
Sorry.
I thought I had a good theory there, but.
Oh, that's good to know. Thank you for explaining that, because I think that's really valid, and it's an important thing to know about the vet community. We're not there. Vets aren't just saying no because they want to say no, and they don't want to see pets, thrive on a specific diet. They're not doing that for that reason at all. They're doing it because there's no concrete evidence that they can, feel confident in referring or recommending a specific type of diet to, like there are for the big conglomerate prescription diet companies, they have funded and done that research. They've said, this is an X disease, we put them on this formulation and they improved, or whatever happened. And I think that's really important to not just understand, but have a little bit of maybe empathy around that whole subject when you talk about a type of diet that doesn't have that evidence, doesn't have the research performed, already. So it's frustrating. It's super frustrating because you would think, I wouldn't think that there would need to be research if we're just simply observing, conducting your own individual research that way and saying, I'm observing a dog in the wild consuming this type of diet. I understand there's lots of nuances to observing research, but anyways, you would think that they know what they're doing. Instinctually, they know what they're doing. They're designed a specific way. They've evolved to eat this type of diet. Their anatomy, their physiology, everything works with this type of diet. Just in a nutshell, this type of diet. And we have just shifted to such an opposite type of diet that we are now feeding. That's where I get hung up, and that's where I get a little bit, on my soapbox. Is I understand that there's no research, but why are we leaning on something so fundamentally different than what they are, naturally eating in the wild? That is, it's a hard one, but it's not a conversation you'll win. And that's where it gets that, the science debate would ensue at that point.
But hopefully more and more research comes of it, right? And so then our goal would be to have that available and be able.
Yeah, we need to get more research out there. And I think that as things grow, I think that you talk about that one bad apple can ruin the bunch. So when we're talking about raw feeding, you have a practice that was started with people doing things like just feeding raw bones and raw meat, and it wasn't necessarily a balanced diet or a complete diet. Like if I sit there and I feed my dog a chicken carcass every day, they're going to get sick. It's not nutritionally balanced because, we've processed it and we've taken out all the innards and that kind of stuff. I mean, there's a long reason of why it's not balanced, but it's not balanced. And we do have in a human food system, we have a system that allows for some contamination. So we know that there can be potentially salmonella or E. coli in the meat that we get from the grocery store, and there probably is, but we're going to take it home and cook it so we don't think anything about it. That could be that we're imbalanced and could have bacterial contamination, and that's where this started. Where today we have diets that are formulated by food scientists, by veterinary nutritionists. They're very competent people that know that we can make a raw diet with all the nutrients that we know from science that dogs and cats need to thrive, but also have all the extra of those phytonutrients and things that we were talking about that come in whole foods. And we can put them in a raw diet. And that's completely different than somebody at home trying to feed a chicken carcass to their dog every day. I mean, it's just two different things. But the veterinary community doesn't see it as two different things. They see it as raw feeding, as, it's the same thing, whether you're doing one or the other. And I don't see it the same way. And there's a lot of reputable companies that take a lot of steps for that food safety. Nobody wants a food recall. And these companies that get the food recall, that can put them out of business. I mean, we're talking about thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars every time this happens. Nobody's doing this on purpose. Right. And so I think that you have companies that really do it right and really are, able to take that food safety and aspect of it and make it safer with like the high pressure pasteurization and the things that I see why a veterinarian is concerned about it. Those can be concerning things, but there's steps that we can take to mitigate that. And we've taken the steps to mitigate that. We've taken the steps to make sure that they're complete and balanced. But then, we're going to have a survey come out that say, well, we surveyed raw feeding owners and, that all their diets are unbalanced. Well, maybe it was the ones that you are making homemade food that it's not quite balanced and appropriate for the dog, but that doesn't say that a commercial food isn't.
Yeah. No, that's such a good point to highlight, that most veterinarians group homemade diets, homemade raw diets, and commercially prepared raw diets in the same category. And that's why that kind of myth is really abundant out there, that raw diets are not balanced. They're not complete and balanced, which we hear all the time as a reason not to feed a commercially prepared raw diet. And at that point with our customers, that's a really easy one. That's probably the easiest one to debunk right there on the spot, is just to say, let me grab one for you. Let me grab a raw food diet for you that we have in our store. And you flip around to the nutritional adequacy claim and it says, boom, right there, complete and balanced to meet the nutritional needs, and these are AAFCO's nutrient profiles that not just commercially prepared raw has to abide by to have that nutritional adequacy, but also kibble, canned, gently cooked, whatever it is. If they have that claim on there, these are all the same nutrient profiles needing to be met for maintenance or growth, whatever it is. Those are across the board. So that one's easy, but it's really important to know that a lot of vets do group those together, and they're very different. And we are not advocating for an unbalanced raw diet, because there's obvious harm in that, right? Like, we don't want that to be the case. And I know for me personally, I know Lisa's had the same experience. We have made either raw or, maybe gently cooked recipes at home. It's hard. It's hard to balance that, especially if you're doing it with whole foods. My goodness. Yeah. So the extra money and effort that it takes these companies to do that, I just applaud them. I just stand back and say, thank goodness that this is available to us and we can purchase it, because I've tried to do it at home and it was nearly impossible. So, and this is coming from someone that this is my job. Like, literally, this is what I do every day. I can't even imagine how hard it is for someone that's new to the industry or new to formulating pet food or making recipes at home. That's just, it's such a learning curve. It's like learning a new language at that point.
Yeah. And that's probably I feel like I'm fairly open-minded when it comes to pets and nutrition, and I try to keep myself open-minded and looking at everything, and like the newest research that comes out, and kind of trying to mold it together, take a little bit of the science and a little bit of the anecdotal, and like, let's kind of let them meet together instead of making them exclusionary. But the one thing that I will not recommend for anybody is a home cooked diet. And I say that only because I know that I couldn't do it. And I ran out of green beans today, so I'm going to throw in some broccoli. Well, that has a completely nutritional composition that's different, a broccoli and a green bean. But I ran out of green beans today. And so and it's called recipe drift is what we call it, when I can formulate pet food for people and using whole foods, but I know that I give you that recipe. If you don't follow that recipe exactly, and you kind of drift a little bit here and a little bit there, and pretty soon you have a recipe that's not balanced again.
They're not testing it. Once you make it at home, you are not sending it to a third party lab like all of these other, commercial pet food companies do. So you're hoping that it's what the recipe, was designed to meet, but you really have no way of knowing at that point.
Yeah. And I always say, like, if you're going to do it in a pinch because you ran out of pet food or something, I've done that, where you're like, okay, tonight I'm just going to make whatever, and it's one meal. But to your point, if it's long-term and it's shifting from a complete and balanced regimen or formula that you've created for them, you can see the deficiencies then form. And I've experienced it even with a vet here. We moved out of state, and so I had to find a new vet. And the first question they asked was, "What are your dogs eating?" And so when I said raw, I was like, oh, I internally cringed, because I'm waiting for it. And she was like, "Oh, okay. Well, is it complete and balanced? Are you making it at home? And I said, no, I'm not making it at home. I purchase complete and balanced raw at a store. And she was like, oh, okay, no problem. And then she moved on, and I was like, whew. So at least they were open-minded to it, but it was the first thing they asked. That the complete and balanced thing is a big thing. I think, still to this day, this was just a few years ago. So it was very recent.
Yeah. And I think it's hard for people to realize that, like, we have a lot of information and we know how to make a complete and balanced diet for dogs and cats based on a lot of research that's been done with processed foods. So we know how much, say, sodium I'm going to add to a diet. I guess sodium would be a bad one because it doesn't change, but like a vitamin B12. Like, I know how much vitamin B12 I need to add to my food that's going to go through an extruder, and then it's going to go sit in a bag, and then it's going to be on the shelf for so long. We don't necessarily know what that is for a raw food, that it doesn't get cooked. So the B12 didn't go away in the cooking process like it normally would. Well, how do we know? We don't really know how long that natural B12 is going to last on the shelf. And then, 6 months down the line, when I actually get it to feed it to my pet, is it actually still there? Mm-hmm. And so these companies that are sending out those analysis are really important for us to support and get behind, because that's where the rubber meets the road. That's where they're saying, like, I can actually verify with tests that I formulated this food correctly. And it's still, when it gets to your pet, it's still correct. But I think that there's so many things that we don't know about how raw foods act and how nutrients act when they're not cooked or they're not, and that our knowledge is lacking in that. And we need to gain more experience in that. So those companies that are testing it are actually saying, yeah, I don't know. So they're acknowledging that the deficiency that we all need to acknowledge that we have, and say that, I acknowledge that we may not know everything about this, so I'm going to go ahead and test it out and prove that my food is complete and balanced.
Yeah, definitely. So this is all just such great information, and I'm so appreciative of your viewpoint specifically. It's important for all of us to understand what's taught in vet school from the get-go, what's not taught in vet school, and then the measures that, veterinarians like you that are of more of a holistic mindset, what you've gone through in order to gain that education. We need more research. So anyone listening to this that can fund $1 million research study, please, please do it. Yeah, there you go. All jokes aside, though, thank you so much, Dr. Katy. We just learned so much, and thank you for your time today, and thank you for all of your insight. If you're talking with your vet, have an open and honest discussion with them. Bring, facts or some support if you have it, but be open with your vet and be willing to understand where they're coming from, and maybe, meet in the middle if you want their opinion on it. But again, great insight. Thank you so much for being on today. And thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. This was great.